Okay, the psychoanalytic perspective. Let's get weird. This is the brainchild of Sigmund Freud, whose name you have certainly heard before, especially if you've had other psych classes. Um, as I mentioned in passing during last week's lecture, um, Freud's basic idea and his innovation was that there were divisions in a person's uh, self and in their mind that then gave rise to imbalances that could influence their behavior. And so he felt like this was what gave rise to disordered behavior. And the psychodynamic perspective that, sorry, I'll use those words interchangeably. Psychoanalytics, psychodynamic, they mean the same thing. It's Freud's theories, right? Um, uh, th- According to this perspective, disordered and abnormal behavior comes from an imbalance in the person's mind and or self. Um, and there's conflict, a tug of war going on within individuals that then has to be dealt with. Okay, so he divided um, the self into the id, the ego, and the superego. Once again, I explained those last time. They are the part of the self that pursues pleasure, that's the id. The part of the self that pursues morality is the superego. And then the ego is the part of you that tries to balance those two forces and get what you want while interfacing with reality. Um, Now, a healthy person, according to Freud, has these three aspects of the self in balance, right? You want what you want, and you know what's right, and you know how to sort of move back and forth between those two without causing yourself too much problem. Um, but when you get high levels of conflict or one of those becomes predominant over the others, then that can lead to problems in behavior. Um, the other division that Freud talked about was between the conscious and unconscious mind, where the things that we don't like thinking, that we find unacceptable, that the superego says, this is not you and you are not allowed to think this or be this or say this or do this, we eliminate those from our mind by putting them in the unconscious. But they don't go away from the unconscious. They just sort of stay there and then can bubble back to the surface. And these unconscious desires and impulses and feelings, when we become aware of them, this causes us anxiety. And this is yet another source of disordered behavior, according to Freud. Now, he felt like there are different ways to uh, get rid of the anxiety generated by the awareness that we want things that we're not supposed to want. And he called these our defense mechanisms, right? Another very commonly used term in everyday speech that came from Freud. They're not even all listed here, but these are some of the most frequently talked about ones. These are ways that people redirect their energy that is generated by their own anxiety, in order to not have to feel bad about themselves. They either repress their feelings or they deny the existence of the unacceptable impulse or behavior. They project their own problems onto others. They rationalize why it's not a problem in the first place, or displace their anger from a target that isn't safe towards a target that is. I'm mad at my boss and I want to punch him, but I can't, so I go and I kick my dog, right? That's displacement. I don't kick my dogs, by the way. Um, at any rate, there's actually even a couple more besides just the ones that are listed here, but Freud felt like these were the ways that people tried to eliminate that anxiety and behave more normally. But some of these are actually really unhealthy ways to do that and can lead precisely to the disordered and abnormal behavior that we're talking about that needs treating. Another aspect, and here's where it really starts to get weird with Freud, talking about disordered behavior, Freud felt like different personalities and problematic personalities were generated by the fact that children move through different stages in their thinking and in their desires. Now, in order to understand Freud's stages, you've got to understand that he believed that children had sexual desires, which does not have any empirical support in terms of things don't actually seem to work this way, but we still talk about these stages because, first of all, they were super influential. They're terms that still get used today. Second of all, some of his proteges that followed after him took these stages and said, okay, the stages that he came up with are bunk, but let's come up with some more relevant ones. We'll talk about that here in just a sec. Okay, so Freud felt that children have sexual desires, as I said, and that at different ages, those sexual desires will have a different physical focus that is related to the primary task or concern that the child has at that age. So, Freud felt like, for instance, the first stage was what he called the oral stage. Children, when they're born and during the first year of life or so, their primary concern is with feeding, suckling, right? And so they are going to be focused on the sensations of the mouth. Freud felt like children at that age derive sexual pleasure from satisfying the sensations of the mouth, right? When I feed properly, when I nurse, then I am satisfied. Okay. He then felt like a child who successfully manages this phase is one who gets fed regularly. There's no problems with breastfeeding or mom's not holding herself back in terms of like denying the child food or whatever, and that it's not a problem. The child is satisfied, and that they move out of that stage, they grow out of that stage and into the next. However, he felt like kids who, for whatever reason, did not get that satisfaction of those oral sensations, then becomes fixated on those sensations, and then turns into an adult who continues to forever be seeking that satisfaction that they never gained as a child. And he called this someone who is orally fixated. Someone who is forever concerned with, the mouth, right? They have to be talking or chewing gum or smoking or messing with their lips or whatever, right? And he felt like this was a disordered personality and one that needed treatment, right? And that was what gave rise to it, was getting hung up during the first year of life on the fact that they didn't nurse regularly and didn't get what they needed, right? Next stage then is the anal stage. Kids around age 2. The task that they are most preoccupied with, again, according to Freud, is potty training, right? Where and when do I poop? And for the child for whom this goes well, they learn to potty train, they figure out when and how to do that, and it's not a problem, and they learn and they grow and they move on. Once again, the sexual focus being on the sensations of the anus, right, during this age, according to Freud. Now, a child who has problems, like they get excessively criticized and it takes them a long time to potty train and they're making messes and whatever, that then Freud felt like turned into an adult who was anally fixated. You've heard people called anal before, right? That is a term that we use all the time. It came from Freud. Somebody who's anal is somebody who's like super picky and concerned with the details and has to be in control, and they probably want things to be super clean and might be concerned with germs and things like that. Freud felt like all of this came from a fixation during those early years, not getting the sensations that they needed, and as a result, getting stuck there for the rest of their life. Okay, so there's other stages as well. He had, I think, 6 different stages, maybe 5. That follow the child up through adolescence that they're supposed to move through. And then different personality types spring from individuals who get stuck or fixated on those particular stages. So he was one of our first sort of developmental theorists who provided stages for us. As I said at the top, these stages, his psychosexual stages, do not have hardly any empirical support from researchers, modern researchers, that actually say this is really what's going on. It seems that children are not excessively concerned with sex or with sexual sensations. under normal circumstances at least. And so this doesn't seem to be what's going on. However, as I said, some of Freud's proteges said this stage theory, though, this idea that kids are concerned with particular things and they can get sort of hung up on those things, that might be worth looking into more. So maybe let's ditch the focus, the sort of weird sexual focus that Freud had, and focus more on what they call object relations, or on social interactions. So one of our primary theorists, who is still a psychodynamic theorist, who was one of Freud's proteges, a guy named Erik Erikson, and he came up with a bunch of stages, or what he called crises, that children move through as they age, where instead of being worried about sexual satisfaction, instead they're worried about relationships and the achievement of particular tasks at different ages, and that's their actual focus. And if they get hung up there, then maybe that can cause some problems that need to be dealt with later on in life. So that's something that, with some modifications from Freud's original wackadoodle ideas, continues to be relevant today and gets treated. There are still psychodynamic theorists and therapists out there who are providing therapies based on these sorts of insights that they're trying to provide to their clients. Essentially, psychodynamic therapy attempts to help you connect to your unconscious mind so that you can become consciously aware of the things that you are unconsciously hung up on or worried about, so that you can then be aware of them and then resolve them in a more logical manner, rather than allowing those things to continue to influence you without your conscious knowledge and cause you problems in your behavior. And so the therapist will try to guide the person to realizations or insights about themselves based on using a variety of techniques. You've got free association, where the therapist will throw out a word and the client is supposed to say everything that comes to mind based on that word without thinking about it. And as you do that repeatedly, supposedly you start to see commonalities as the therapist amongst things that they are saying, the client is saying, that then give some insight into what they're really worried about. Because they're not actually thinking about it, they're just sort of spouting out whatever comes out. And then the therapist's job is to interpret what is coming out and turn that into something useful that can help the person have insight into themselves and give them some advice as to how to resolve some of those concerns in a reasonable and rational way. Now, traditional psychodynamic therapy lasted for years. You would go in for an hour or two multiple times a week to lay down on the couch and free associate and talk about your childhood relationships and what your parents were like and all of this stuff. These days, not so much. The influence, as I was talking about last time, of insurance companies means that they want you to get to it and get better quickly. So we've had psychodynamic therapies adapted to short-term therapies, where instead of spending a lot of time delving into your childhood, the therapist will instead try to get directly to what's bothering you now. And what is it that's causing you problems now? Is it your relationship with your boss? Is it your relationship with your spouse? And let's get directly to that rather than building a foundation of where you started and then going from there. Okay, now in terms of the psychodynamic model, the psychodynamic model is massively important historically because it was the only game in town for several decades early in the 1900s in terms of actually helping people address what was going wrong in their behavior. Even now, it continues to be useful in addressing some of those intangibles that the behavioral model, or I'm sorry, the biological model is specifically bad at addressing. Sometimes things don't have a physical basis. Sometimes there's something going on in your mind that needs to be resolved, and you can't really put a finger on that or point to it in an MRI scan. But it can still be really important, and so psychodynamics really tries to address those intangibles and has at least some success in doing so. Now, the weaknesses is that a lot of the foundational ideas of psychodynamics, well, are unsupported, right? And so it's a theory that has had to adapt as our methodologies improved over the course of a century or so. Um, and also, a lot of the ideas just aren't testable, right? Aren't falsifiable. I can't really say what's going on in my unconscious because I can't actually observe it, and I can't even actually know whether or not it truly exists. And so it's difficult to test and to observe and to replicate any sort of experimental methodology using psychodynamic ideas. So that's a weakness for sure, because we really like to be able to pin down what's going on and be able to point to the factors and causes and all of that. And psychodynamics is less concerned with that sort of approach. It is an idiosyncratic approach. It deals with the individual, not with the average of everybody. Okay. Okay, I think that is all I want to say about psychodynamics. Great. Our last video will be about the cognitive behavioral model.